I'm Christina Sullivan. I am the GME Director for Education and Assessment, and I'm incredibly excited to welcome Dr. Nicholas Stark today, who will be talking to us about career negotiation, practical skills. And just want to take a couple of minutes to introduce Dr. Stark, who is a board-certified emergency physician who's working at the intersection of clinical care administration and innovation. He is a former chief resident at UCSF and now works clinically at UCSF and serves as the assistant director of UCSF's Acute Care Innovation Center, where he leads teams through design thinking and rapid cycle optimization processes to create tools that improve patient care. He also works clinically and serves as the vice chair, director of operations, and director of quality at Mercy Medical Center in Merced, California, where he's currently reinventing their vertical care system and building processes to streamline hospital admissions, revitalizing patient experience efforts as well. He has extensive experience leading health system-wide quality improvement initiatives and has received the National Patient Safety Leadership Award. Nationally, Dr. Stark is also the founding co-director of a digital-based business curriculum sponsored by ACEP and EMRA, a co-founder of the Emergency Medicine Innovation Collaborative, and serves on several boards and committees, and is really well known to our residents in terms of this talk itself. So he has spoken at GME College several times, and this talk in particular is always a really big hit. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Stark. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for the warm welcome. It's great to be here and great to see you all. We have a great intimate group today, so I'm excited to hear your feedback as well. So if questions come up, feel free to raise your hand. I'll keep an eye on the chat as well, and look forward to talking negotiations with you all today. So I'm going to share my screen. Is that showing up okay for everyone? Perfect. All right. So welcome to Career Negotiation Skills for Physicians. This is one of my favorite talks that I give, and I'm really excited to explore this with you all today. Really appreciate the kind introduction. You heard a little bit about me. So went to UCSF for residency and now work both there clinically as well as in Merced, California, and kind of do some hybrid, both clinical and leadership roles. And I think particularly poignant to this lecture, just over a year ago, I was negotiating my first contracts post-residency, and I've been living this lecture in real time as I move through my first positions post-training. I would like to acknowledge before I begin the privilege I have as a cis white man and how that impacts my experience with negotiations. But I've attempted to make this lecture broadly applicable, and I want to recognize each experience is unique. So we've got just about over 50 minutes today, and a lot of our discussion is going to focus on negotiations as it relates to your future career. But also the skills and concepts here are transferable to everything from working with consultants to interacting with patients and family members. So I want to start off today by setting the stage, where we'll briefly discuss some key foundational pieces to put in place before you begin your career negotiation. And this is useful regardless of where you're at in your stage of training. So things like CVs and cover letters. From there, we'll move into the preliminary negotiation phase. So these are the steps that are immediately before negotiating, like timelines and communication tips. After that, we'll get into some foundational negotiation pieces that will build our negotiation toolkit. So these skills apply both for career negotiations as well as a lot of other scenarios. And then we'll explore obstacles to negotiation, or things that often trip us up, like biases and cognitive traps, before we end with some real life ways that you can apply the concepts from today to your life moving forward. So before I start, I want you to take a moment to reflect on why you're here. Are you at the end of training and starting to look for jobs or interviewing? Maybe you recently signed a contract. You're wondering if you got a good deal. Or you're an intern or a medical student just wanting to get a jump start. Regardless, negotiations are everywhere, and it's a really important skill to have throughout your career. And this lecture, while it's focused a lot on career negotiations, has concepts that are transferable to other aspects of your life, whether it's work in the hospital to time with your family or friends. And in fact, I'd argue that those everyday negotiations, lower stake things, so things like deciding who's going to do the laundry or who's going to walk the dog, those are perfect ways to practice these skills to prepare you for higher stakes negotiations, like your first contract. So take a minute to reflect on where you're at and where you want to go. And if you have a sheet of paper or your phone nearby, just write down a quick sentence of what brought you here. And whatever it is, having that clarity mission, I think, will help you maximize the impact today. All right, so let's start off with setting the stage. Here, we're going to briefly discuss some of the key foundational pieces that you should have in place before you start your career negotiations. So this is things like CVs and cover letters. And regardless of where you're at, even if you're early in your training, you can jumpstart these today. So a CV or curriculum vitae translates to the course of your life. And it's different from a resume in that, unlike a resume, which is usually just 1 to 2 pages and places most weight on your work history, a CV is longer and more detailed, and it puts more focus on things like research and certifications. And your CV is important because it's one of the main ways you're going to communicate your interests and experience with potential employers. So every piece of this is important, and we'll talk about some of them in particular, from the font size down to the spacing. On the right side of the screen, you can see the first page of mine here. And typically, physician CVs use involvement from med school onwards. So now is the time to ditch those high school and college accomplishments. I recommend keeping a couple versions of this. The first one's a running CV. I think of this as your foundational CV. So it's something that you continuously update, that's detailed and complete, and it's mostly for yourself. So if you don't have this, I'd start one now, maybe set off some time today or this week. But if you do have one, set aside some time to make sure it's up to date. And the running CV forms the foundation for what you'll present to employers, which I call the job-specific CV. That's a periodic version of your CV that includes the most relevant data for the position you're applying for. And you basically pick and choose pieces from your running CV to put into this. It's more like a snapshot. These tend to be shorter, usually 2 to 3 pages max for non-academic jobs, but academic CVs are often quite a bit longer. CV content has a lot of variation, which is why it gets kind of confusing, but there are some constants. So to start at the header, including your full name and degrees, one thing that's commonly missed is if you have a degree in addition to an MD or a DO, listing that, whether it's an MBA, MPH, etc. And then below that, putting your contact information, phone, mailing address, and email. And from there, you'll split things into sections, which is where all that variability comes in. And deciding which to include is a perpetual struggle and something that takes a lot of thought. It's going to be different for everyone, but typically some or all of the items listed here are included. It's also important to make sure you list start and end dates for these. I do the date, the year, and the month for those. And depending on your interests and experience, there's some flexibility here. So for me, for example, I'm interested in health systems leadership and wanted to highlight admin and operations work, innovation work, and QI experience. So I actually separated those out into individual headings on my CV. For some additional help with content here, you can also reference UCSF Academic Affairs format. If you Google UCSF CV, it'll pop up. The next big piece, as far as laying the foundation, is your cover letter. The biggest advice I have here is to follow the cover letter instructions if there are any. But if not, the most important step and tip is to keep it succinct. So it's not a personal statement. You're aiming for 3 to 4 paragraphs that's written in a positive professional tone and focusing on the following 4 key areas. So the position you're seeking, any connection to the area or institution, whether that's family or personal, etc. How the role and location fits into your career stage, goals, and timeline. And then finally, the skills you bring and how your employment will benefit both you and the employer. Some other best practices are to keep it individualized because employers tend to know each other and talk. And then also use action verbs. So this is the time to use those verbs like solved, promoted, adapted, improved, planned. Here's a cover letter example. Full disclosure, this is mine from my job applications a year and a half ago. So you can see as we go through, I list the position right away. And then shortly after that, my connection to the community and why I want to be there. I weave career fit in throughout the 4 paragraphs and also focus in on some skills that will help benefit both myself and the employer. So when it comes to your career fit and skills, I'd keep it relatively focused. There's a lot of time and space to highlight, or there's time and space to highlight 1 to 3 items from your CV, but don't highlight all of your CV here. And then I'll also be sending these slides out and the meetings being recorded. So feel free to catch it from those, or if you want to take a picture or screenshot, that's fine too. Some additional important aspects as you work to set the stage, thinking about references. So these are colleagues or mentors, and potential employers are going to want to hear from them. So you want to identify 3 to 4 folks early on, whether they're senior colleagues or mentors or teachers, and help them advocate for you by sharing your CV with them and highlighting some of the most relevant aspects to them. It's also important to think about your online presence. So this is the time to do that uncomfortable thing where you search yourself online and check what the results are showing. This is important because it is important to know if folks have similar or identical names to you, so you can address any issues early on. So in this example on the screen, you can see there's another Nick Stark, who's a police officer in Southern California, who was arrested for criminal charges. So it's just important to have an idea of what's out there. This is also a really good time to look at your professional accounts like LinkedIn and Doximity. Make sure those are up to date because those are some really high yield search items. And then finally, staying in tune with other practicalities. So do you need to apply for a medical license in another state, or register for a DEA, or update your name or address? I recommend getting started on those early because they take time and you don't want to hold up your employment because of it. All right, so now that we've given some thought to what brings each of us here and set the stage with some of the best practices for our CVs and cover letters, let's talk about an often forgotten but critical piece of career negotiations, and that's understanding the job landscape and communicating with potential employers, or what I think of as the preliminary negotiation phase. So what happens before we actually hone in on a job and start negotiating that contract. One of the first things is getting an idea of how the landscape looks. So trying to zoom out and analyze what's out there. A big thing for this is creating a timeline. So for many of us, this is our first time that's really on our own schedules, and we're kind of acting as free agents. There's no more July cycle deadlines, no more ERAS. And while that's really freeing, it's also, at least for me, was really intimidating. It's important to be proactive, start early. For a lot of fields, that's 9 to 12 months in advance or sometimes more. So if you graduate in June, a good time to start thinking about this is the prior fall. A good landscape analysis starts broadly and uses multiple approaches. So informal networking can help you understand the landscape. And I think really broadly here, don't just think about others in your program. Think about your alumni from your program, friends, people you've rotated with on off-service rotations, connections from professional societies. All of those networks are really important for understanding the landscape. And then also as you're mobilizing that network, doing some deep dives on more promising options that interest you. So for example, if that's UCSF, that means understanding the organizational structure, both of UCSF as an enterprise, but then also your department, how and when they hire, what kinds of positions are available, whether that's full-time, part-time, per diem, something else, and any potential gaps where you could put your specific skills to use. And finally, putting what you're finding into broader context of supply and demand, thinking about it on a bit of a macro scale. So how in demand are your skills? And that can vary by time, location, a variety of factors. For example, for me, I was in my first job search kind of just towards the second half of COVID. And in the first half of COVID, what had happened was ED volumes plummeted. And so a lot of folks either cut shifts or they removed physicians from the schedule. So I was entering a relatively hostile environment for hiring, and that made me recognize needs for things like geographic flexibility and bringing in my other skills and interests. Another key pre-negotiation tip is around communication. Communication is the foundation of our relationships, and because of that, it's the foundation of negotiation. The biggest thing here is to know your audience. There are a lot of different types of communication and styles, everything from folks that are communication drivers, they're straight to the point, all the way to amiables who are much more focused on relationships. And knowing what style of personality you're communicating with can help you tailor what you say and how you say it. As an example for this, on one of my job interviews, we didn't actually talk about the job until the last 3 minutes of the conversation. My potential employer spent most of that time learning about me, my background. He knew I was interested in leadership, so even asking questions like, how do you think about leadership? And having that audience and communication style in mind really helped me shape my expectations and my response. Also being mindful of delivery. So a lot of times, especially with much of our virtual and mask-based communications now, it's easy to forget critical communication pieces like body language, tone. Focus on how the other person is speaking and try to mirror that. That can be a really helpful negotiation tip. I'd also recommend practicing. Practice your content out loud before the meeting. I practice this presentation out loud before I talk with all of you. Whether that's for an interview, a conversation, saying the things out loud can help you find some weak spots. And the goal is not perfection here. It's just to focus on getting some reps in. While you're practicing, try incorporating some meaningful pauses. Although those can feel uncomfortable, they're often really impactful. You also want to be prompt. So whether that's email replies, aiming for less than 24 hours, or for meetups, arriving 10 to 15 minutes early. Quick note on that, it's just as important after you accept a position too. So being on time with signing the offer letter, the onboarding process, that helps you set yourself up as a reliable member of the team. Then finally, always coming prepared, whether it's a phone call, a site visit, a formal interview, treating everything as if it's an interview. That means before that conversation, learning about the organization, the position, looking at your CV, being ready to highlight what you're most proud of, and having some questions ready. For my interview process, several of what I thought were introductory calls actually ended up being the entire interview. And depending on the job, it can be relatively informal and may catch you off guard. So that's why I recommend being really prepared. The career search process can be very circuitous, and there's no cemented process or timeline. And every situation is unique. So most often, the process meanders a little bit, just like what's building on the screen in front of you right now. And you may double back to certain pieces. And sometimes you'll get an unexpected curveball, like a delay or a stalling technique. But in general, the components typically include first learning about positions, whether that's word of mouth, networking, ads, then getting introduced to their leadership for further information, starting to apply if there's a formal process, and that's where your CV and cover letter come in. And then an interview, whether that's virtual, on the phone, in person with a site visit, maybe even a panel interview. Following up after that interview with potential references, and then either being given an offer, a rejection, or something in between. If you are given an offer, negotiating the terms, and then either accepting or declining that offer. All right, any questions right now as we head into, otherwise we'll head into the next big piece, which is negotiation foundations. All right, so with that background in mind, we're gonna get into the content that probably brought most of you here, which is how do I negotiate my future career, my future contracts? So to take things just a step back before we dive into this too much, I want to pose the question of why even think about negotiations. So I'm going to give you an example that I think may help convince you of the importance of negotiation just in general. So the example is this: you and your friend get the exact same job at the same time in the same city. You have the same role, same initial salary, same everything. Now, if you decide not to negotiate, but your friend does, and because your friend negotiates, she gets a $7,000 increase for that initial year, and then she continues to renegotiate every couple of years. By the end of 30 years, your friend is likely going to be making an average of $100,000 more per year than you, just by negotiating. So let that sink in, and hopefully demonstrates a little bit of the value of what we're going to be talking about. So if that convinced you to keep listening, negotiation, how do we define it? If you Google negotiation right now, you're going to see hundreds of results. It ranges from a discussion aimed at reaching an agreement to the process of bargaining in an attempt to reach an agreement. But I don't really like any of these definitions because they focus too much on positions, and that makes the whole process seem a lot more adversarial than it needs to be. So I want to shift the paradigm to problem solving, and I propose we think about negotiations like this. It's a problem-solving process designed to reach an agreement when you and the other party have some interests that are shared, some that diverge, and others that are opposed. So with that in mind, we're going to start exploring some of the ins and outs of negotiations. We'll start with laying a foundation of two big negotiation approaches or theories, as well as some other foundational concepts like ZOPA and BATNA, before ending with some cognitive traps and real-life examples. So I'm going to start by highlighting two negotiation techniques, and the first one is a technique called positional negotiation. This is often thought of as a traditional negotiation style, and full disclosure, I don't really like it that much. I think it tends to be fairly adversarial, and I don't think it's robust enough to handle complexities of career negotiations most of the time. But I do think it's really important to understand, and it has some key components that are really helpful. So positional negotiation is focused on taking and then giving up a series of positions. And it can either be hard or soft, depending on personality and the existing relationship. So in the hard positional style, participants see each other as adversaries, and each has the goal of victory. Parties tend to mislead as to the bottom line, they apply pressure, and they demand one-sided gains as the price of getting to an agreement. On the contrary, in the soft positional style, participants see each other as friends. The goal is to just agree. So they'll disclose their bottom line, they'll yield to pressure, they'll accept one-sided losses, all for sake of reaching an agreement. And it can be a bit of a challenge to decide what approach to take. And if you're like me and a little more prone to that soft negotiation style, you're more vulnerable to someone who utilizes the hard approach. I do want to note this process tends to produce some type of agreement, but it might not be a wise one or a fair one. So let's solidify this with an example. Say you need to buy a new car, so you go to the car dealership with your eye on a new EV, and you ask the dealer, "Hey, how much for this new car?" She tells you it'll be $36,000, but offers it to you for $35,500 because she knows you have a lot of debt from med school. And you come back with, "That's way out of my range, but I'll offer you $28,000 cash." So the dealer comes back to that and says, "What about $34,000? And on and on and on we go. Do you ever reach an agreement for the car or do you walk away? Well, it depends. So in positional negotiations, each party typically has their own target. So that's what they'd like in a perfect world. And you can see that on the top line here. And then their walk away or their bottom line. However, these aren't typically disclosed, which is part of what makes it so confusing. The potential overlap between the two parties before they walk away is called the zone of possible agreement. So if anybody wants to chime in the chat, I'll give just a second here. What do you think the zone of possible agreement is for the buyer and the seller in this case? It's a lot of math, and I know it's a sunny Thursday, so I'll give you the answer. The ZOPA here, or the zone of possible agreement, is between 32 and 33,000. So the seller ultimately is willing to go as low as 32, the buyer as high as 33, and that's how we get that number. The tricky part, though, is finding that ZOPA, especially when each party's concealing their walkaway price. So next, we're going to talk about a slightly more nuanced way to think through alternatives when things aren't going that well. So even though we don't know the ultimate outcome of the case, did you and the car dealer find the ZOPA or not? We can predict it by thinking through each party's BATNA. BATNA stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. And it's essentially what you're going to do if you fail to reach an agreement. So in that case, for you, can you live without the car? Do you have an electric bike, other modes of transportation? Are you looking at a car at another dealership? And for the dealer, can she live without the sale? Does she have another potential buyer? So for every negotiation scenario, whether it's positional or otherwise, thinking about your BATNA ahead of time can make it easier to resist pressure and temptation in the moment. And in career negotiations, for example, the BATNA is often other job opportunities, or thinking about things like alternative systems, alternative locations, timeline flexibility, per diem work. The one thing I'll highlight here is the better your BATNA, the greater your leverage. So giving that some thought ahead of time is really helpful. Now, thinking about the positional negotiation technique that we were discussing, you might be seeing some holes in that style of negotiation, and it might have you wondering, are there other options? The answer is yes. There are tons of negotiation theories out there, and each technique could be a lecture in and of itself. But next, I'm going to focus on an alternative that is incredibly well researched and one that I've found really effective in my own life. It's called the principled negotiation technique, and it was developed as part of the Harvard Negotiation Project, and it's designed to produce wise outcomes efficiently and amicably. If what I'm talking about next piques your interest, I'd recommend checking out the book called Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher and William Murray. Ultimately, the principled negotiation technique distills negotiations down to 4 elements that should be addressed as part of every negotiation. The first is people, so separating the people from the problem and attacking the problem, not each other. The next is interests, focusing on underlying interests rather than positions. The third is inventing multiple options to look for mutual gain before you decide what to do. And then the final is basing the result on some objective standard criteria. So we'll go through each of those in turn. But compared to positional negotiation, in principled negotiation, things focus more on interests rather than positions. Participants are problem solvers, so they're not friends, they're not adversaries. Your goal is a wise outcome that satisfies both parties' interests and is fair and long-lasting. You avoid having a bottom line altogether rather than misleading or disclosing your bottom line. You're open to reason, and you invent options for mutual gain rather than demanding gains or accepting losses. The bedrock of principled negotiation is relationship and communication. And one of the most critical aspects of the principled negotiation process just starts with recognizing the person or people on the other side of the table with you. They're humans. They have emotions, they have deeply held beliefs, they have different backgrounds. They're prone to biases and blind spots, just like you and me. And good negotiation involves building a relationship with open communication that helps separate the people from the problem and enables you to discover the other person or group's interests and motivations. So building that relationship and building trust, that's ultimately how you discover the people and interest pillars of principled negotiation. I'd say most importantly, this takes time. Depending on your situation, you may have a lot of time, you may not have very much at all, but use as much time as you reasonably can. A lot of times, even just the passage of time is a really good negotiation tactic. Next is to ask open-ended questions that help you learn more about the other person or group's perspective and interests. So thinking and asking things like, can you tell me about any current clinical or non-clinical gaps and challenges? You also want to focus on active listening and discovering information about the other party's interests in this phase, not necessarily forming new proposals or asks. There's time for that later. But one thing you're doing as you're zooming out and really listening, I push you to think through possibilities the other party's bringing up and being able and willing to make some micro pivots in real time. That openness to rethinking can really help strengthen the relationship and explore mutual interests. All right, so after the foundational people and interest components, we move into the inventing options phase of principled negotiation. And one of the biggest things to recognize here, there is no single right answer. If you look for the single best answer from the outset and you skip the brainstorming phase, you're probably going to miss some really good opportunities. And another big error people make is the assumption of a fixed pie. Negotiations does not have to be an I get what you want or you get what you want type of zero-sum game. Look for option for mutual gains where you both win and identify shared interests. The fourth and final step of principled negotiation is establishing objective criteria to use as a benchmark. So settling differences in a negotiation based on will alone comes at a really high cost. And the way you get around that is by negotiating on objective criteria. So like every part of principled negotiation, this requires research and thoughtfulness. But the aim is to create gauges that are easy for both sides to agree upon. Things like market value, precedent, professional standards. Again, that takes time, but this is a place particularly where mentors and your alumni networks can really be key. So let's solidify this with another example. For this one, let's think about an insurance policy. So say you recently crashed your bike, which at $4,000 as a resident is the nicest thing you own. At least it was for me. Thankfully, you've got some insurance and you report your loss to the insurance company. They call you back and let you know that you're entitled to a $2,000 settlement. Now you hear this and you're honestly kind of disappointed with the low amount. And you ask the company how they determined that figure. And they respond that it's how much they decided the bike was worth. So you press a little bit more and say, well, what standard did you use? And do they know where you can get a comparable bike for that amount? So at that point, the adjuster gives in a little bit and says, fine, I'll give you $3,000, but not more due to company policy. And you ask how the company figures that amount out, and the adjuster says, just take it or leave it. At that point, you realize things have gotten kind of tense, so you diffuse the situation to buy some time, and you say, 3,000 might be fair, I don't know. I understand your position and if you're bound by company policy, but I'm hoping to get some objective criteria for that amount. So you ask to just take a couple of days, look at things further, and talk again. So you talk again a few days later. The adjuster says they found an ad for a similar bike that costs $2,800. You probe a little bit and find out it's an older model with a lower tier of gears and brakes, and you ask how much that increases the value. So the adjuster looks that up and they say $600. And ultimately you walk out with $3,400 to use toward a new bike instead of the initial $2,000. So hopefully through those examples, you've learned a little bit about how principled negotiation can be a thoughtful approach to career negotiations, as well as all kinds of other life situations. Now is a really good time to take a step back and reflect on that reason you wrote down for being here today. And how does what you learned so far apply? And as you ponder that, I want to share a framework that I think can be really helpful, especially when thinking through complex, high-stakes negotiations like navigating your next career move. So I've adapted this negotiation preparation worksheet from one of my MBA courses, and I think it does a really nice job of making sure you take advantage of your biggest asset when you go into a negotiation, which is research and preparation. This file will be included as a resource post-session on the wiki as well, and I'm happy to share it by email, so feel free to reach out or take a screenshot. But to briefly walk through it, starting in the upper left and going along this first row, you start off with thinking about the parties, so you and your potential employer, and what issues need to be resolved. So for a lot of us, that's developing a fair and agreeable contract. Then we move over to thinking through our BATNA as well as that of the other party. So do you have another job offer? Are they desperate to have you or currently have a really saturated field with a lot of applicants? After that, moving into your interests, whether that's a salary, title, role, etc., as well as their interests. And at that point, and not before then, you're ready to start building out options. So these are proposals on ways you can meet both your and the other party's interests. I try to brainstorm at least 2 things here and think outside the box, including things like career development or roles or non-competes, in addition to the monetary items. At that point, you're ready to jump down to the second row and start thinking about what criteria we can use to add legitimacy. That's where that background work through similar job titles and salaries comes in. Remember to utilize your alumni networks for that. And then the last 3 boxes are a little broader scope, but really important for building your case. So thinking about how you want to communicate all of this. What questions do you want to ask? Also reflecting on how your relationship is with the other party, both how is it now and how do you want to improve it in the future? And then finally, what challenges do you anticipate? Do you expect them to refuse your request for a larger sign-on bonus or maybe be unable to offer you a leadership role or the office space you want? Now, this type of worksheet takes time, usually at least 30 to 60 minutes, but often a lot longer. But that time is well worth it. And I guarantee that using something like this to frame your thinking will help you feel more prepared to make the most out of your negotiation conversations. I'll pause there for just a moment if there are any questions. Otherwise, we'll move into the final phase of the lecture, which are some obstacles and then some real life applications. All right, so let's talk about negotiation obstacles. Now that you have that background on communication principles and negotiation techniques, we're going to shift gears a bit and talk about some common situations that derail negotiations and decision making. These are called cognitive traps, and I'm going to teach you both about them and how to overcome them. There have been decades of research into the ways our minds make decisions, and that research has shown that we use unconscious routines or heuristics to cope with the complexity that's inherent in our day-to-day life decisions. And complex decisions like those involved in negotiating your career are no exception to this. So for this example, one heuristic that we have as humans is when we're judging how far away an object is, our mind relies on a heuristic that equates clarity with distance. So the clearer an object is, the closer we judge it to be. The more blurry it is, the further away we judge it to be. But this heuristic isn't foolproof. So for example, on a foggy day, our eyes often trick our minds into thinking that objects are more distant than they actually are. Now take that with a grain of salt for most situations, because it isn't a big deal and we can safely ignore it most of the time. However, for pilots landing a plane, that type of distortion and distance to the runway can be deadly. So that's why pilots are trained to use objective measures like altitude, heading, GPS, in addition to their vision. The most dangerous thing about cognitive traps is their invisibility. So we're going to highlight these and bring them to the forefront today to better understand them and then learn to better compensate for them as a result. The first obstacle I'm going to talk about are cognitive biases, and these can dramatically impact our decision-making. They're often called implicit biases and are attitudes toward people or stereotypes that we hold without conscious knowledge. These biases have really devastating consequences, like earning gaps and glass ceilings. Just taking gender as an example, in a study by the Harvard Business Review, they had both men and women ask for raises. Women only received a raise 15% of the time, while men got a raise 20% of the time, all while using the exact same script. And while that might sound modest to some, it has some really long-term career impacts. And we see similar distortions when we look through lenses of race, sexuality, age, weight, religion, and more. So I encourage you to explore your own implicit biases with Project Implicit via the QR code on the screen if you haven't already. And really, awareness here is the first step in dismantling cognitive biases, and building that awareness takes time and investment. All right, go ahead and open up your Zoom chats. And I'm going to ask for a little bit of involvement with this next piece. So I want you to respond to this question. There are probably greater than 100 licensed physicians in Manhattan, New York. So what is your best guess of the actual number? How many licensed physicians do you think are in Manhattan? I'll give folks just a second to respond. Any number is fine. Your best guess. I see 3,000. Anybody else? 20,000, 50,000, 10,000. Great. So this example highlights a trap called anchoring. You may recognize this cognitive trap from the clinical arena as well. So we often learn about it leading to medical errors. Anchoring means that our mind gives disproportionately high weight to the first information it receives. So we've been using this specific example for years, and it actually started with my predecessor, Dr. Lowell Tong. But when we set our anchor at 100 like we did today, the typical response is actually around 6,000. So we had a 3,000 and a 10,000. A couple other higher ones than usual though too, with a 20,000 and a 50,000. When we set the anchor at $1 million, the mean lands closer to 125,000. So what's the actual number? The actual number, which Monica was very close to, as of July of this past year, was 19,445 physicians in Manhattan. So clearly, anchoring is a trap we should try to avoid. What can we do about it? The first thing, always try to view a problem from different perspectives rather than sticking with the first line of thought that occurs to you. Next, thinking about the problem from various perspectives, and thinking about it on your own before you consult others to avoid anchoring to their ideas. And then specifically in negotiations, thinking through your interests and your options before you head into that negotiation to avoid being anchored by the other party's initial proposal. The next obstacle is called the status quo trap. And this one is when we value an item that we possess more than a similar item possessed by another. So classic experiment here is when some researchers randomly gave a group of people one of two gifts of approximately the same value. So half of people got a coffee mug and the other half got a bar of chocolate. And they were told that they could easily exchange the gift for the other gift as often as they would like. And now intuition would tell us that probably about half of people would want to make some type of exchange, but in reality, only 10% did. The status quo exerted its power, even though it was just arbitrarily established a few minutes before. So how do we combat the status quo trap? First, it's important to recognize that the status quo sometimes may just be the best choice, but you don't want to choose it just because it's comfortable. So never think of the status quo as your only option. Try to identify other options and use those as counterbalances. And then also ask yourself if you'd still choose the status quo if it wasn't the status quo. The last tip here is to avoid exaggerating the costs or the effort involved in switching from the status quo. So this obstacle, the last one we're going to cover today, is called the framing trap. And this is all about how framing the question is so important. So that question that we ask is one of the first steps in making a decision and also one of the most dangerous steps. The way we frame problems can have really big impacts on the choices we make. So for this, let's take a look at HIV testing. This one hits close to home and comes from a study here in San Francisco in 2011 to 2013. And that showed that how we frame the question nearly doubles the number of patients who are tested for HIV, even when adjusting for confounders. So in this study, if the patient was told, you can let the doctor know if you'd like an HIV test today, there was about a 38% acceptance rate. Versus if the patient was told, you'll be tested for HIV today unless you decline, there was a 66% acceptance rate. Now, this framing trap can take a lot of forms, such as as the HIV example shows here, it can also be really closely related to some other traps like anchoring and the status quo. There are two types of frames that tend to distort decision-making the most frequently, and I'll zoom in on those right now. So the first one is framing as gain. Go ahead and get your chat boxes up again, and we'll have a little bit more participation. So for this one, say, for example, you get called in to work an extra shift, and there's potential to get paid for it. Your department has a total of $1,000 that can ultimately be paid for the shift. But of course, it has to be a little complicated. So you get two options. Your first option, option A, is you have a 100% chance of getting paid $250 for the shift. The second option, option B, is that you have a 33% chance of getting paid $1,000 and a 66% chance of getting paid nothing. So which one would you choose, option A or option B? Go ahead and drop it in the chat. No wrong answers. Seeing pretty much A across the board. And I agree, that's what I would pick too. So when they've studied this question, typically around 70% of respondents choose the less risky option, which is option A. That's because when gains are at stake, most people prefer a sure thing. Now we're going to flip that on its head. So I want you to erase that prior example from your mind. And the example is the same. So you still have $1,000 that you could be paid for work, an extra shift, and there are two options. Option C is you have a sure loss of $750. Option D is you have a 66% chance of losing the full 1,000 or a 33% chance of losing nothing. So which would you choose? Go ahead and drop your answer in the chat for this, C or D. I'm seeing D so far, which makes a lot of sense. So when they studied the question flipped this way, 80% of respondents tend to choose option D. And that's because when losses are at stake, most people are more risk-seeking. And that's because for most people, losses are felt more strongly than gains. I do want to add a caveat here, though, as well. This also varies really dramatically based on your reference point. So if you have $100 in assets with no foreseeable income, your perspective is very different than if you have $100,000 in assets with a steady six-figure income. But regardless, it's important to be aware of the framing trap so that we can keep our perspective really broad. Now, how do we do that? First, we don't automatically accept the initial frame, so try to reframe the problem in various ways. And then next, try posing problems in a more neutral or redundant way that combines gains and losses together. Think hard about how problems are framed and ask yourself how your thinking would change if the framing changed. All right, so we've discussed strategies to mitigate risks of falling into cognitive traps, but I'd like to highlight 3 big takeaways that apply to all of the traps that we've discussed. First, awareness is the first big step. By recognizing that these traps exist, you're already better prepared to confront them head on. Next, it's important to take time to examine choices from multiple different viewpoints. So it can be helpful to talk with mentors and, as always, to do research to make sure you have the full landscape in mind. And then finally, I recommend building in some explicit pauses to check yourself throughout the process. So ask yourself, am I anchoring or am I falling into the status quo? Am I fixating on the wrong frame? Building in these pauses, especially right before you make a decision, can help make sure you've got the perspective you need to make the right choice. All right, so over the past 45 minutes, we've learned about the pre-negotiation phase. Then we talked about some foundational negotiation principles and some common obstacles to negotiation. Now let's dive into some ways that we can apply these concepts in real life. And to do that, I'm going to share some of my biggest pearls and personal examples from my life over the past few years. So before I talk with you about a negotiation example, I want to give a quick overview of some of the biggest components of your career negotiations, which are compensation and benefits. So say you've got your contract. What kinds of things should you be thinking about? And what are some common negotiation parameters? One of the first things is to identify who employs you. Is it an independent staffing group? Is it a health system, a university, a city's Department of Public Health, maybe? And then as part of that, you want to consider the pay structure. So 2 of the most common pay structures, which are often referred to by their tax categories, are salaried or W-2 or independent contractor or 1099. In general, the way I think about these is a W-2 is typically more inclusive. So includes things like health insurance, retirement matching a lot of times, but often at the cost of overall less pay. And for a 1099, no taxes are withheld. There's no contributions to retirement by an employer, and you pay all of your own insurance, but you typically get paid more overall. In addition, as you're thinking about that, it's helpful to think about how you get your income and if it changes with time or metrics. So for example, whether you're strictly salaried or if you're paid a % of revenue or RVU, if there are incentives like a QI bonus, or maybe something like a partnership track that you buy into over time. Now, it's fine and very common to negotiate the salary component of your contract, but depending on the employer, there may or may not be flexibility there. So there are some other things you can do to expand the pie. And typically, honestly, to be honest, I recommend focusing more on these additional benefits more than salary. So to explore this, think about your ultimate work and life aspirations. That's going to help you brainstorm some ways to expand the pie that can ultimately help you get there. So thinking about things like a sign-on or a relocation bonus. Maybe benefits are really important to you, and those can make a huge difference. 401k retirement matching, health insurance, parental leave, funding for your boards or for continuing medical education, parking. A lot of employers will also negotiate by offering to pay part or all of your student loans. That's a particularly powerful lever because of some substantial tax benefits. And then also thinking about softer parameters. So these are things like your role or title, whether that be in research, education, leadership, something else. Also thinking about career development, ranging from connections to people or systems to mentoring, opportunities for growth. Maybe there's some room with work flexibility and some remote work, perhaps office space, the presence or absence of a non-compete clause, professional development and support. So that's things like funding for continuing medical education or conferences. The list goes on and on. And what I'd recommend is thinking about your ultimate aspirations. What do you want to do? And what are some ways you can expand the pie to get there? So to close, I'll help try to solidify some of the concepts with an example from my own life over the past year. So for perspective, I framed my initial job search out of residency around two big priorities. The first was great clinical experience, and the second was opportunities for leadership. Some second-tier priorities for me included reasonable compensation and a lack of a non-compete clause so I could continue engaging in some consulting and other work without issues. So that initial process was a long journey with plenty of hiccups, and it ultimately led me to two roles. One W-2 role as a part-time faculty at UCSF, and then the other as a 1099 role as an emergency physician and director of operations at Mercy Medical Center in Merced. So I started both of those roles in August of 2022 and felt really satisfied with my initial negotiations. However, with time, my priorities started to shift a bit, and my focus started shifting more toward leadership growth, flexibility, and feeling that my time is valued, which, yes, is another way of saying that I wanted a raise. So that's been a big lesson for me over the past year. Your priorities will evolve, and that's okay. What's important is noticing that and then thoughtfully engaging your employers in that process. So that brings us to earlier this year, mid-2023. And I felt like I was getting some great clinical experience and had good initial leadership roles that I was excelling at. But I was also wanting to grow and increase my flexibility to have more time to enjoy having arrived at being an attending after all of my training. And I also wanted to feel a little better compensated for the value I was bringing to my sites. So I started at the beginning, right where we started this lecture. I looked at the landscape of the systems I'm working at and the departments I'm involved in. And at that point, I had the benefit of intimately knowing the environments I was working in, and I was able to identify some gaps and start inventing some options. For me, inventing options meant looking really critically at gaps and having honest discussions with my employers. And what I learned may not surprise you. Our leadership team at UCSF is pretty saturated with not a ton of opportunity for immediate and accelerated growth, either within the department or more broadly. But at the same time, I was learning that there were some changes coming in Merced that would make some extra room and that they were willing to increase my administrative stipend while also giving me some more scheduling flexibility for shifts. So that ultimately led me to a point where I needed to make some difficult decisions. Should I continue on my current trajectory or make some adjustments to better align with my evolving priorities? And I ultimately chose the latter and now continue my work at UCSF in a slightly reduced clinical capacity, while I have expanded to lead the Department of Emergency Medicine in Merced as their vice chair, director of operations, and director of quality. And I'm getting a lot of good exposure there, both department-based and hospital-wide. Through all of this, I have been keeping some of my longer-term priorities in mind too, which for me includes helping lead a large health system someday. So I've continued to grow my relationships with mentors and advisors at UCSF, even though I'm currently spending a little less time clinically than I had initially. And throughout all of this, I've made a point to communicate clearly and honestly with both of my employers. And that's helped me keep both of these doors open while continuing to grow with my priorities as they evolve. So I hope that was helpful. We started again at the beginning of our journey 50 minutes ago with setting the stage, talking about CVs and cover letters. We then moved into the preliminary negotiation phase where we talked about our landscape analysis and communication. before moving into negotiation theories and frameworks, and then some cognitive traps and how we can avoid them. And finally, these real-life applications. You've got my email here on the slide. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'm happy to answer questions and help coach people through the process. All right, well, thank you all for joining today. And I dropped my email in the chat as well. So any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help. And thanks for sharing your afternoon with me.
Thank you, Dr. Stark.